When Bioshock Infinite came out in 2013, it had the unenviable task of needing to live up to its predecessor, the original Bioshock, which had long since been canonized as a classic for its brilliantly realized story and setting. Sure, there was Bioshock 2, but the team behind that game was clearly more focused on polishing and perfecting the gameplay experience of Rapture rather than trying to match the first game on a narrative level, which led many to dismiss it initially, though it has garnered more appreciation in the years since. Infinite, on the other hand, had ambitions to surpass its predecessor in its storytelling, to tell a story more daring and exciting. And if you'd asked me at the time, I would have told you it was exactly that. To this day, I still look back on my first playthrough of Infinite as one of the most compelling video game experiences I've ever had, so absorbed I was in its wild story and inspired aesthetic design. Contemporary reviews of the game largely agreed with me, so for a while my opinion was persistently reinforced by the positivity of the game's mainstream reception. On the more obscure side of games criticism, however, Infinite was less favorably received. Common points of contention including the game's reliance on uninspired first-person shooter mechanics, major elements of its story being underdeveloped or outright bungled in execution, and perhaps most damning of all, that for all its intellectual posturing, it appears to say very little of substance about its subject matter. At the time I wasn't completely ignorant of these critiques, but I found it pretty easy to dismiss them. I chalked it up to people not getting what the game was going for, or hating on it for its success. I made a lot of excuses for this game, to myself and others, because I just couldn't help but love it. But that was 16-year-old me. 16-year-old me was thrilled at the very idea of Infinite and its ludicrous narrative ambitions, probably more thrilled at the idea of it than the reality of it, and that in hindsight can be quite blinding. 24-year-old me has grown quite a bit as a person and as a consumer of media. Things that before I might have waved off as minor flaws or inconsistencies now carry a lot more weight. While the outpour of positive reviews defined Infinite's launch, it's been the continued critical dissection of the game's imperfections that's defined its legacy. And while this legacy clashes with the defensive 16-year-old part of my brain that refuses to die, the 24-year-old part sees all this and can't help but wonder, would I even like Infinite anymore? So I went back for the first time in years and played it all over again, and the short answer? Yes, I still like Bioshock Infinite. But its flaws are far, far more apparent to me now, and run much deeper than I previously was capable of realizing. What I remembered as a profound, meaningful story comes off now as an amalgamation of cool concepts and heavy themes with no distinct through line. It's a strongly plotted game, it's easy to fall into the swing of it and just enjoy the ride like you would a well-paced movie, but trying to read into it on a more meaningful level is made frustrating by the game's lack of cohesion. The sheer potential of its many ideas is still enough to excite me, but that potential is never even close to reached in the game's actual execution. And I think it'd be worthwhile to talk about why that is, because, well, I don't know, I guess I just like talking about Bioshock Infinite, and I imagine if you click this, you probably do too. Let's get started. Oh, one more quick thing. I will be spending some time early in this video talking about the first Bioshock as a means of illustrating some of my problems with Infinite. I can imagine this will annoy some people, and not without reason. They are different games with different design goals and whatnot, but they share a genre, a developer, a franchise, and a lot of design motifs. Frankly, it'd be silly to pretend like there's any better comparison. And no, this isn't going to be me saying that Bioshock is the perfect specimen of video game narrative or anything like that. It too is a flawed game, but it succeeds in a lot of the places where Infinite failed. And there's going to be spoilers, obviously, for both Bioshock and Infinite. Anyway, so what is Bioshock Infinite about? There's a lot you could say that would technically be correct. You could say it's about American exceptionalism, because it is. You could say it's about the relationship between Booker and Elizabeth, because that's also true. You could say it's about quantum mechanics and the possibilities of an infinitely spanning multiverse, and yeah, that's a pretty essential part of the story. You could say it's about the propagation of institutional racism, and how the downtrodden people who fight to change oppressive systems are actually just as bad as the oppressors. Wait, that doesn't sound right, does it? We'll come back to that one later. This is what I mean when I say the game's scope is absurdly ambitious. It explores such a wide variety of concepts, each seeping with potential depth in their own right, which altogether give the game the strong impression of substance for sheer volume of material. It's the kind of game that can certainly be said to ask a lot of complex questions, but what it's actually saying by asking those questions is harder to articulate. The game's scope hurts it in this regard, as its array of grand concepts, however interesting individually, struggle to intersect in a meaningful way. For instance, it isn't evidently obvious what American exceptionalism has to do with quantum mechanics, and even though there are some pretty interesting conclusions you could come to by asking such a question, there's no clear accumulative picture for all the possible questions Infinite's wide-spanning narrative poses. Think of it this way. In an ideal story, every individual part of what makes up the story, from the details of the script to the unique elements of the medium, contribute to that story's conveyance of meaning. Each part is done the way it is for the deliberate purpose of reflecting the narrative's central themes. In a well-crafted story, nothing should be done that either contradicts those themes or distracts from them in an unproductive way. each element helping to define the overall story, which in turn helps to define the individual elements. This is something the first Bioshock does really well, as the individual elements of that game, from its core gameplay to the different threads of its plot to its overall aesthetic design, are all reflective of its central critique of objectivism. The game's story starts out simple enough. Your character Jack survives a plane crash in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, leaving you no choice but to descend into the underwater city of Rapture. You quickly become entangled in a feud between friendly freedom fighter Atlas and Rapture's antagonizing founder Andrew Ryan, traversing various themed districts of the city, each revealing more of the objectivist ideology that Rapture was built to reflect. The story throughout the bulk of the game remains simple and somewhat abstract. You rarely come face to face with any characters of note, most only chiming in as they please through your radio, meaning your direct engagement is less with the immediate plot and more with getting to know the city and what it stood for. It paints a pretty thorough picture of how Rapture's Randian values, plus a touch of unregulated genetic enhancements, define the different areas of its culture, and how the principle of putting oneself above all else when taken to its logical extremes has some pretty horrific results. Hell, if you were to take all the actual plot out of Bioshock, leaving only the crawl from district to district without the context of Atlas and Ryan's war, you'd still have a pretty thorough exploration of the folly of objectivist thinking purely through the masterful work that went into making Rapture. But that doesn't stop the plot from taking things a step further. You eventually reach Ryan with the intent to kill, only for him to reveal to you that you've been a pawn of Atlas since before even coming to the city, that you were born for the express purpose of doing what you're doing now, and that you've barely had an ounce of genuine agency in all your meager existence. You, like the Little Sisters and Big Daddies, are an ironic product of Rapture, built merely to do as you were told. The creation of such an agentless being should be a slap to the face of Rapture's supposed values of individual empowerment, but you're just one victim of many to the hypocrisy that corrupted Rapture from the inside out. Free will is a cornerstone of objectivist belief. One who cannot truly choose has no power over themselves. If our actions are out of our control, then we are merely slaves to fate rather than masters of our own universe. Jack is obviously in a pretty specific situation, having been genetically bred to bend to the command of "would you kindly," but the key is that he didn't know this until Ryan opened his eyes. He carried on. We carried on. Through all of the game up to this point, likely without second-guessing our reasons for doing so. We were ignorant of just how ignorant we were, making the reveal all the more blindsiding. While the rest of us may not literally be mind-controlled, how much of anyone's life is actually in their control? How many of the defining moments in your life, the things that shaped your personality and outlook on the world, happened because you chose them? How much of what we do, of how we think, comes down to it simply being what we've always done, how we've always thought? None of these things are certain, and that lack of certainty, that lack of confidence in the self's ability to triumph over preordained factors, kneecaps everything objectivism purports to be true. Let's consider that same question we asked of Infinite. What is Bioshock about? And again, there's a lot that could be said. The inherent destructiveness of an unregulated free market, the impossibility of complete individual agency, the loss of humanity to unrestrained biological tinkering, the list goes on. The difference between this and Infinite, though, is that all of Bioshock's themes are tied together in their pertinence to its ultimate critique of objectivism. Bioshock uses its science fiction to inform its philosophical musings rather than merely to give the game character. The presence of genetic enhancements in Rapture, both as a cultural norm and a product on the market, embodies the objectivist zeal for progress and personal improvement, the living picture of mankind descending to become their own gods. It is precisely this, in tandem with the complete lack of regulation on Ryan's part, stubborn in his belief that the market should be free to shape itself however it pleases, even as people die and go crazy as a direct result of Fontaine's product, that leads to Rapture's fall. As without proper regulation, there's nothing stopping someone like Fontaine from conning his way to a position of power. Rapture isn't a failed attempt at achieving an objectivist utopia, it was a resounding success at realizing objectivism in its purest, most uncompromising form, and that's precisely why it all went to hell. So let's turn our thinking back to Infinite and try to parse what's at the center of its various narrative threads. While this sort of thing is, of course, a matter of subjective interpretation, I would argue that it's the game's exploration of American identity that is the best fitting piece. It's what shines through most vividly in the construction of Columbia, themed end-to-end with its warped Americana, just as how objectivist values are what define the look and atmosphere of Rapture. It's a theme that resonates strongly with the arc of the player character, Booker DeWitt, as well, so I think it's fair to say that these ideas are at the core of what the developers intended. Okay, so it's about America. Cool. Now we can start intellectualizing about how quantum mechanics and capitalist exploitation play into the game's commentary, and we can have a lot of fun with that. But only so long as we're selective about what parts of the game we're talking about. There's been a lot written about Infinite from people way smarter than me, but I've yet to read any singular piece of criticism of the game that managed to account for every individual thread of its thematic mess. You have to squint at Infinite for a while, filter through the parts of it that don't coalesce with whatever you're focusing on, in order to develop any substantial point about what it might be saying. I played through the game twice during the making of this video, and after the first playthrough I spent a while trying to come to conclusions about what the game was saying about the things it was so obviously trying to say something about, beyond that racism and capitalism are horrid realities of American life. On my second playthrough though, I kinda felt silly having tried so hard at this, as I realized how unconcerned the majority of the game is with this aspect of its story in favor of just being about Booker and Elizabeth. And that's fine for what it is. Troy Baker and Courtney Draper's performances hold up remarkably, making the relationship a believable, compelling constant in the game's whirlwind of ideas, but there's nothing explicitly analogous between their relationship and the game's broader commentary on America, except maybe if you squint, like I said. Practically speaking, the game's broader themes may as well be background to the otherwise unrelated story of the pair's escape from Colombia. That isn't bad in and of itself, but when it comes to reading into the game's narrative on a more meaningful level, the seeming separation between the immediate plot of the characters and the more ambient storytelling of Colombia's dissonant depiction of American culture means they cannot help but distract from each other, as opposed to how the plot of Bioshock helped to calcify the themes laid out in its depiction of Rapture. This is why saying what Infinite is about is so difficult, as its own focus is so scattershot, coming off as unconcerned about the bigger picture it's painting. This wouldn't be such a problem if the amount of different thematic variables being juggled weren't so grandiose. If the game were a dinner, it'd set the table with a decadent and alluring set of entrees, only to stuff its face with a bit of each, trying to fit as much into its mouth as possible rather than savoring any of the flavor, forgetting that it needs to leave room for everything to be chewed so it chokes. Trying to analyze this game on a critical level, then, means performing the Heimlich maneuver so that you can try to interpret whatever half-chewed mess comes shooting back out. That's putting it a bit extremely for the sake of an indulgent metaphor, but you get the idea. Now, to the game's credit, it's attempting to tackle much more complicated ideas than that of the first Bioshock. Putting objectivism in its place isn't all that hard or brave. I read Atlas Shrugged my freshman year of college. Not for a class or anything, I just wanted to seem smart. And even then I couldn't help but laugh at the thought that anyone took that goofy-ass book seriously to the point of defining their whole worldview. What Infinite aims to critique is vastly more complicated. In fact, it's the reasons why discussing such things is complicated that makes Infinite so potentially interesting. I say potentially because, well, like I said, you really have to squint in order to make anything of it. Another common critique of Infinite is that its villain, Zachary Hale Comstock, falls flat, especially compared to Bioshock's Andrew Ryan, and the comparison is more than fair, both being the founding tyrants of their respective sci-fi cities. While Comstock's tyranny is more or less built into the foundation of Columbia, Ryan's tyranny is used explicitly to highlight his hypocrisy, his betrayal of his stated worldview in the face of its collapse, though he'd be loath to admit it. You may only encounter him face to face in the one scene, but Ryan's presence is felt throughout the game, be it through the many audio diaries of his personal musings or his calls directly to you through the radio, stifling your progress or just trying to psych you out. He comes off as a man holding desperately onto the ruins of his life's work, and when the golf club finally comes down, you're really providing him an escape. A way out that doesn't involve having to admit he failed. He gets to die feeling superior for having stuck it out as long as he could, and for having flipped your world upside down in the moments before his death, and that being his priority tells you a lot about the guy. Ryan worked so well as a villain for Bioshock because he embodied the ideas that game was critiquing, and while the same is certainly true for Comstock, Infinite's more amorphous approach to its theming makes this approach to characters somewhat more suspect. It's difficult for a single character to represent the kind of broad ideas that Infinite plays around with, but when we look at the whole picture of Infinite's narrative, Comstock's role makes sense. I may even go so far as to say he's a good villain, even if the game itself does a hell of a lot to obscure that fact. Ryan is helped by the fact that his philosophy was concretely defined. Despite his authoritarian turn, it's clear he genuinely believed in all his objectivist ramblings up until the end, contradictions or no. But what does Comstock really believe in? It isn't wholly clear if he truly buys all his own prophetic garbage or if he's just a grifter saying what he needs to say to meet his ambitions. Given this, I don't think it's the substance of Comstock's beliefs that really matter so much as what is implied by showing that a man like him, preaching the ideas he does in the way he does, has found the power that he has. Consider a scene from early in the game where, as a show of influence, Comstock orders his men to stand down, letting you walk right by them as they bow their heads in prayer. You can execute these men, one by one if you so choose, and not one will shake from their obedience to the prophet's will, such is Comstock's power in Colombia, such as the hold his words have on its people's hearts. Even from your first moments in Colombia, it's made abundantly clear that Comstock is more than just a religious leader to the city's well-to-do, but is akin to a figure of worship, more so even than the god he purports to be the prophet of. It begs the question, why? What is this guy selling that people are so willing to buy? The answer is probably best defined by American exceptionalism, or more specifically by manifest destiny, a term used to define the cultural attitude that prevailed in the frontier era of American history, when the West was just sitting there waiting to be tamed by the bastion of civilized democracy that settled to the East, whose self-asserted superiority entitled them to take it all and make no apologies about it. It was for the betterment of the world, after all, that the nation's virtues of liberty, equality, and democracy be spread far and wide. It's easy to see how such ideas would resonate with a nation like America, built on the prospects of a new world free from the burdens of the old, a place for its people to start anew with the freedom to define that how they see fit. It was a nation born from bitterness at the old world's failures, and so naturally, it considered itself a remedy to that world's ills, pure in a way that no other country could claim. This assumption that America's separation from the deep and troubled histories of the old world somehow freed it from that world's mistakes is, of course, a total fallacy. But that didn't stop the widespread cultural attitude that saw America as a genuinely superior nation, innocent of the crimes of the past and embodying the moral ideals of the future. The implication being that it was also dutied with the ethical mandate of spreading those ideals as far as possible, by force if necessary. This righteousness became an essential part of America's self-mythology, a cultural justification for the country's imperialist ambitions that thoroughly watered down the atrocities committed toward that goal. Time creeps on, however, and where once there was a vacuum of history, the story of a nation is filled in, and the story of America turned out just as bloody and vicious as any from the old world. Look no further than the massacre of Wounded Knee, one of the most famous instances where US soldiers slaughtered hundreds of Native Americans for next to no reason. With such scenarios as Wounded Knee informing their nation's history, Americans were faced with a reckoning of identity. How do you compromise a value set that proudly proclaims all men are created equal with the actual, tangible reality of all the men and women who were at best exploited and at worst decimated in the act of supposedly spreading those values? The process of taming the West was far from civilized, leaving any American whose worldview wasn't sharply colored by bigotry with an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. Equality, liberty, democracy, what does any of it really mean if this is what it brings? What truth is there to the American dream when the majority of free Americans find themselves with little choice but to be thrown into the meat grinder of industry, where they see only a fraction of the fruits of their labor while a cabal of elites accrues an inconceivable amount of wealth? What moral superiority can a nation claim when it has so much blood on its hands? It is precisely this dissonance that accounts for Comstock's success in gathering a city's worth of followers to his veritable cult, as Comstock wraps the trappings of exceptionalist thought in divine authority, mandated not merely by some rationalization of moral superiority, but by a God-given proclamation of America's righteousness. Religion certainly played into Manifest Destiny in reality, but in a more abstracted way than what we see with Comstock, whose fable of being chosen by the angel Columbia to take on the mission of God is about as direct as you can get in asserting yourself as the capital G good guy, who can do no wrong for you are an agent of the big man upstairs himself. This, in tandem with the country's already internalized exceptionalist notions, makes for an attractive ideological concoction for those looking to reap the bounty of America's conquests without having to acknowledge its inherent hypocrisies. God says you're in the right, so just enjoy your apple pie and don't think too hard about everything going on around it. Isn't that enticing, when the alternative is to recognize the nastiness of the world, the unchangeable menace that permeates American society? It is the fact that this sales pitch sold to so many that matters more to Infinite's story than Comstock as a character. For all he may embody these ideas, the game keeps him at a distance, drawing instead on its critique of the American character at large. To this end, the game's greatest success is in how holistic Columbia feels as a place, as much a reflection of this critique as Rapture was of objectivism. Everything works to this end, from its frontier-inspired neoclassical architecture to its aggressively nationalistic propaganda, portraying minorities and the impoverished as deserving of their lesser stations, and anyone who disagrees with the status quo as an enemy in need of smiting. It can certainly be a bit much at times, the sheer amount of racist caricatures you're forced to endure coming off a bit like the devs doubling down on edginess for the sake of shock value, but it never feels out of place, and works to hammer home the extent to which bigotry has been internalized by the city's populace as a means of sustaining their worldview. So if the environmental design is capable of expressing the game's more nuanced critiques, why even have a central antagonist like Comstock? For most of the game, the character's fixation on him, rather than on everything around them, feels like a distraction from the game's real narrative strengths. This probably wouldn't be the case if Comstock were used in more direct and interesting ways throughout the story rather than being largely uninvolved, but as it is, Comstock's presence detracts from the game's conveyance of its broader thematic ideas more so than it adds to them. Until the very end of the game, anyway, in which the story does ultimately benefit from his presence, though the reason why is as frustrating in its execution as it is interesting in its implications. Infinite's final minutes are breathtaking, especially your first time through, though even on repeat playthroughs I always find myself swept up in the theatrics of it all. Booker and Elizabeth suddenly appearing in Rapture, ascending to a surface of doors and lighthouses, learning major revelations that alter our understanding of everything that came before. It has all the resonance of a satisfying ending to Booker and Elizabeth's journey, even if, upon examination, the game's choice to hold back on these revelations until its very last moments only really serves to bolster the moment itself, and in all other ways detracts from the story's true substance. I'm talking principally about the game's final mind-blown moment. Booker's realization that Comstock is him from another dimension, specifically a version of him who, after participating in the massacre at Wounded Knee, couldn't ignore the fact that he was complicit in one of the most heinous massacres of Native people in the US's history. In response, Booker changed his name to Comstock, christening this new beginning by bottling up all his guilt and doubt and throwing it into the deepest, darkest hole he could find, instead embracing the most extreme impulses of the exceptionalist mindset that had driven him to Wounded Knee in the first place. Before he would sell righteous exceptionalism to the masses of Columbia, Comstock had to sell it to himself, to save himself from having to confront the fact that he was the villain of the story, not the hero, a fact that somewhere deep down he understood. We know this because, in another world, Booker denied these impulses, but rather than embrace compassion and seek redemption, he gave way to a complacently jaded outlook. No more would he try and convince himself he was the good guy, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't continue to get his hands dirty doing the sort of work he'd proven so adept at Wounded Knee. This Booker never became a prophetic tyrant, but he remained a thug to the same vile forces that Comstock would go on to embody himself. Unsurprisingly, this life never brought Booker peace. He turned to vice, namely gambling, to bury his pain and, perhaps unconsciously, to punish himself. Though it was not him who suffered the most for this, but his infant daughter Anna, whom when Booker's creditors come a-callin', he gives up to save his own ass. To his credit, he does try and weasel out of the deal, as Lutece puts it, but he's too late, and Anna is taken from him, leaving him to wallow in even deeper guilt and despair. Anna was taken by Comstock, who stole from his alternate self what he couldn't produce on his own, an heir to his work, a legacy to ensure his vision of Columbia raining righteous hellfire upon the sinful world below comes to fruition. After Comstock betrays the Luteces, who equipped him with the tech he needed to facilitate his agenda in the first place, the pair, unstuck from time and space, contrive a situation that brings Booker to the world of Columbia under the pretense of having to save the girl he doesn't realize is his own daughter. We could get into the whys and hows of all this if we really wanted, but for the purposes of my argument anyway, it's really not relevant. What is relevant is how this twist reshapes our understanding of the game's themes, and justifies elements of the story that weren't previously grounded in theme. The whole multiverse quantum physics angle of the sci-fi doesn't really mesh into any understanding of the game's critique of American identity until we come to see Booker and Comstock as two sides of the same man. Suddenly, the use of a multiverse allows for a pretty articulate illustration of the split personality at the heart of the American character. One side that embraces bigotry as a virtue in the name of exceptionalist superiority, and one side that quietly rejects that outlook without meaningfully confronting it. Booker's journey through Columbia is no longer a simple infiltration of a hostile city full of anonymous zealots, but is a tour through a place he could have created himself in another life. A place built on ideals that once so disgusted him to see in himself, but here, in this world, he embraced. This, as a concept for a story about interrogating the American character, is brilliant. In concept, anyway. But the sad reality is that the game does very little to encourage reading it in this way. With how it's presented, the game seems pretty fine with players thinking nothing more about the twist than, holy shit, didn't see that coming, which, to its credit, it does a very good job at. But when it comes to the larger thematic implications of the twist, the game doesn't seem to care. You can replay the game knowing the twist and pick up on new things, sure, but there's surprisingly few scenes that take on markedly new meaning with this information. Imagine a version of Infinite that didn't save this information until the very last moment, one where Booker realizes the truth of his relation to Comstock before the latter was killed. Imagine what a conversation between the two would look like, both privy to the knowledge that they are disparate reflections of the same man. How fascinating would that have been? How much more meaning would we be able to derive from the game had it engaged with these ideas directly rather than leaving it all up in the air? Simply put, the game's prioritizing of its theatrics, its ambitions towards being cinematic, that old chestnut, over the actual substance of its narrative takes so much away from the possible nuances of its concept. Even so, I'd be remiss to say that all of Infinite's narrative efforts fail purely because of this poorly considered presentation of its twist. As the thousands of words I've put in this section show, there's still a lot to derive from how Infinite develops its core concepts, even if, as I've said a number of times now, you have to squint and be selective about what you're considering important or meaningful to the story. Even in such a state, Infinite's engagement with these complicated, challenging ideas revolving around American identity yields worthwhile fruit that, when considered in a more thorough way than the game itself invites, is as complex, thorough, and fascinating as anything one could say about the first Bioshock. However, and this is a big however, there is still one significant portion of the game's story that I've said very little about. A portion that, more than any overuse of caricature or mishandling of a vital twist, makes me deeply skeptical of the dev's true narrative intentions for how bafflingly dissonant it is with the themes we've now discussed at length. What I'm talking about, as I'm sure many of you have guessed, is the Vox Populi, and it's a whole can of worms. I'm hardly the first person to take issue with how the game handles the Vox. It's easily the most controversial element of the game's story, and has inspired many a think piece regarding the carelessness with which the group is portrayed, especially their leader and only real character, Daisy Fitzroy. The Vox are built up in the early game as the only faction in the city of any significance that opposes Comstock's rule. Their ranks are made up of the poor working class relegated to the slums of the city, all of them minorities of a kind and undeniably oppressed by the institutional and cultural norms that are so appealing to the city's well-to-do. It makes a lot of sense that a Marxist-style revolutionary faction would grow in such an environment, and given the game's clear disdain for the dehumanizing exploitation of capitalism, depicted in no uncertain terms in the Finkton section of the game, you'd expect the game's story to valorize the Vox's cause. They are, after all, the collective embodiment of the victims of the exceptionalist righteousness that so much of the game is aimed at critiquing. You'd be wrong, though, because the vast majority of the Vox's time in the game is spent portraying them as little more than thugs. When they first meet Booker, he's recently been knocked unconscious by Elizabeth. Before he's even come to, they knock him out again, then dangle him out of an airship to wake him up, then lean on him to do their dirty work. It's fine for them to be skeptical of Booker, fine for them to be renegade in their approach to revolution, but this frames them pretty sinisterly. Still, this is forgivable enough, nothing the game can't recover from. Until the Finkton chapters end, where a full-on revolution has consumed Columbia, and the Vox, without exception, revel with sadistic glee at the violence wrought on their former oppressors. Not a single one looks on despondently at the chaos of the situation. Not a single one shows mercy to an innocent bystander. Not a single one tells their comrades to chill the hell out with the scalping and the talk of rape. They are, universally, consumed by bloodlust. And for all the game seems to care, bloodlust is the extent of their ideology. It's all the more baffling for how much the Finkton chapter of the game builds on why the Vox's revolution was necessary. Booker at one point even says that sometimes there's precious need for folks like Fitzroy because of folks like me. And for a while there's consistency to the game's point of view, one that seems to acknowledge that the systems of exploitation at play in Columbia, reflective as they are of America at large, can only meaningfully be countered by forcefully overthrowing those systems, a revolution. By the time the revolution is actually taking place, though, Booker switches up his opinion by saying, when it comes down to it, the only difference between Comstock and Fitzroy is how you spell the name. This is probably the most widely panned line from the game, and it absolutely deserves to be. How the fuck could Booker justify that statement after everything he's just experienced? And the fact that the game doubles down on this both sides hot take by having Elizabeth echo similar sentiments not long later only further asserts that the game has no interest in exploring the nuanced morality of a justified but violent revolution. The Vox are only useful to the story for how they move the plot forward, and reading into it further than that is just asking to be frustrated. Perhaps if there were a more tangible basis for this portrayal in the context of American history, it would work, but I have honestly no idea how this point fits into the game's broader themes at all, unless you want to strip away the specifics of its criticism of American culture in favor of an even broader, vaguer critique of anyone who tries to hold power in society. This, as far as I care to think about it, is the best possible justification for Booker's heinous line comparing Fitzroy to Comstock, and if you can't tell, I do not think it cuts the mustard. If Infinite really thinks that violence committed in the name of bigotry and imperialism is no different than violence committed in the name of thwarting oppressive systems, then I have a hard time actually believing the game was intentional in communicating the more complex critiques I previously attributed to it. There's a lot you could say in defense of the game, like that, regardless of if the revolution is justified or not, the violence on display from the Vox goes beyond necessity and into outright cruelty. And that's what the game is decrying, not the prospect of revolt in general. Fair enough, but as I've said, the game draws no distinction between the Vox's violence and their ideology, or, more accurately, the lack thereof. What we get in its place is a platter of Marxist motifs, a lot of talk of the people and raised fists and the color red and all that, without any real clarification, any articulation of purpose other than to get the oppressor's boot off their neck. If that's all we're working with, then there's hardly a basis for turning the entirety of the Vox into riotous fiends, since this implies there was always something inherently fiendish to the prospect of freeing oneself from oppression in the first place, even when the oppressed had no other option short of waiting for the oppressors to decide to stop. I'm not trying to say that the game needed to make the Vox a faction of wholesome freedom fighters with no edge to them. If nothing else, I can at least appreciate that the game doesn't take for granted that a revolutionary faction would be nothing short of virtuous. I just wanted more nuance than the black and white way the characters in the game react to these situations. Daisy Fitzroy is the only character of any significance who is a part of the Vox, and she's their founding leader to boot, which puts her in a position not unlike Ryan or Comstock in that her character stands in for the ideological values of her faction. The problem being that there's not a lot of substance to the Vox's beliefs other than to bleed the Colombian elites dry, so it's unfortunately true that there's little to Daisy beyond this either. She has next to no screen time in the game, and the handful of audio tapes from her only fill in her backstory somewhat, elaborating on how she was framed by Comstock for the murder of his wife, which led to her becoming a wanted fugitive, eventually founding the Vox in the name of fighting Columbia's founders. Fitzroy's character is developed a bit more in an ebook titled Bioshock Infinite Mind in Revolt, though I admit I haven't read it, nor even heard of it until I began work on this video, and I have to imagine the same can be said for the vast majority of Infinite's players. From the synopsis I've read, though, the book's characterization of Fitzroy is useful in understanding her actions in the game. It ends with Fitzroy escaping captivity at Comstock House with the help of a doctor, who'd previously been trying to analyze her to understand her deviant mind, but who eventually came around to seeing her as an intelligent person fighting a righteous fight. So he helps her escape, and for his trouble, Fitzroy shoots him dead, unmoved by his change of heart for all the damage he'd already been complicit in. It doesn't matter that he eventually saw the light, he was past forgiveness for Daisy Fitzroy, and the same extends to everyone in Columbia who isn't raising a rifle in the Vox's name. This shows plainly the dark side of Fitzroy that the game only really presents in her final scene, the side that holds the high-minded ideals of her movement second to her spite, her deep-seated resentment for the systems that have grinded her down her entire life, so deep-seated as to be unforgiving to any and all who were complacent within that system. This, like so much of Infinite, has a lot of obvious potential that the game fails to realize, much more so than what we've previously talked about with Comstock. In that case, the game laid out all the proper pieces to its conclusion and just failed to do much with them that invited deeper engagement with the ideas. In Daisy's case, we have to untangle the game's confused messaging in order for it to even make sense in the context of the game's larger themes. Had Daisy been given more opportunities in the game to express her way of thinking, this revolution in the name of wrath rather than justice, then seeing her turn into a rubbing the blood of your enemies all over your face psycho would have made a lot more sense. Fitzroy may very well be a complex, layered character, but you wouldn't know it from what we see of her in Infinite. And the game is worse off for it, because without these elaborations, it's hard to contextualize the game's skepticism of the Vox as not being skepticism of the very prospect of altering the status quo, which in a game otherwise so committed to critiquing the American status quo of capitalist exploitation and exceptionalist bigotry, is antithetical to the spirit of that idea. Let's dispense with all this talk of theme and context for a minute though, and just talk about why the scene where the Vox become enemies just sucks on a simpler level. After fighting side by side with the Vox through Columbia's ravaged industrial district, Booker and Elizabeth take an elevator up to confront Fink and take the blimp Fitzroy promised Booker a few dimensions back. Daisy phones into the elevator recognizing Booker, who in this world worked alongside the Vox, initially as a means of acquiring Elizabeth, but eventually becoming a true champion of the cause, to the point that his face is plastered on the Vox's own propaganda and his name is being used as a rallying cry for the revolution that is at hand. Vox hero Booker DeWitt died, but this doesn't stop the common soldiers of the Vox from happily taking up arms beside the new Booker, cheering his name as he deftly disables a Zeppelin single-handedly. Fitzroy, though, apparently sees her comrade revived and immediately jumps to the conclusion that he's an imposter who complicates the narrative. At this point, with her revolution clearly successful, what exactly is Fitzroy worried about here? If she has ambitions towards power that Booker's presence would disrupt, how come we've been given zero indication of this? Wouldn't it make more sense for Fitzroy and Booker to actually talk about his sudden reappearance before she just decides he needs to be put down? Would that not have been the perfect opportunity for the violence of the Vox's revolution to be meaningfully confronted in a dialogue with Daisy, rather than just the half-hearted, equivocating musings between Booker and Elizabeth? What we get instead is a run-of-the-mill shootout. It's another instance of the game avoiding its most interesting possible permutation for the sake of keeping the roller coaster pacing chugging along, the game seeming to think that stopping to think critically will mean players lose interest. Players who are already several hours deep into the game, and past its most meandering bits, mind you, so who exactly they thought they were appealing to here is lost on me. As it is, you get off the elevator to find Vox soldiers are now hostile, the same soldiers who, when you got on that elevator, were all totally cool with you. You watch Fitzroy shoot Fink and rub his blood on her face because she's that far gone, man, and then you battle some Vox before Elizabeth sneaks behind Fitzroy, who's holding Fink's son at gunpoint and talking about how what they're fighting can only be stopped by pulling it up from the roots, and stabs her in the back with a pair of scissors. Rather than use this as an opportunity to explore Daisy's justification for child murder, a juicy topic if there ever was one, it's used as a trite character beat for Elizabeth. She's done a murder, so she feels bad, but it was to save a child, so worth it? It's a lazy means of forcing some darkness into Elizabeth's character arc, and it isn't anything anyone hasn't seen before, which, when you consider how much of Infinite is truly inspired and original, is more than a little disappointing. When you're squinting at Infinite looking for meaning, all these grievances about Daisy and the Vox are likely among the things you'll have to look past in order to get at the real substance of Infinite's narrative, and as we've seen, there is plenty of meaning we can glean from the game while completely ignoring this egregious misstep. However, with a story that is consciously about the hypocrisies of American culture and the ways it has historically victimized and suppressed minority voices to preserve itself, there's no escaping how the game's handling of Daisy plays into those exact trends. On top of being the only major character of the Vox, Daisy is the only major character of color in the whole game, other than the odd audio log or two. Looking at it that way, the fact that the game's only major black character is defined solely by her hate for rich white people, and she ultimately serves the story as little more than a plot device in the arc of a white character, is a bad look, to say the least. It isn't helped by the DLC, which retcons Daisy's motive to show that the Lutesses strong-armed her into threatening child murder for the specific purpose of forcing Elizabeth to kill her. This retcon, no doubt a hurried bit of damage control on the devs' part, misses the mark entirely, taking away what little agency Daisy had in the plot and making her death at Elizabeth's hand explicitly contrived, which is only a little more contrived than it was to begin with. It's this that makes me so skeptical of the game's authority to critique these elements of American culture in the first place, because it highlights the limits of the game's perspective. One of the things you could fairly say Infinite is about is whiteness. Not simply because you play as a white protagonist, that'd be most games really, but because the game engages critically with whiteness as a concept, exploring how ideas of white identity are formed and perpetuated. There's an audio log you can find of Comstock where it's implied that he has some Native American heritage, something that his fellow soldiers berated him for. Even as someone who passed for white, he was treated as lesser for his blood, and it's implied that this inspired his overly enthusiastic participation in the massacre at Wounded Knee, an attempt to appease his white comrades, to show that he was one of them through cruelty toward the other. It was this act of appeasement that sparked DeWitt's crisis of consciousness, the crisis which split him down two distinct paths separated by the bounds of reality. It's another layer to the already fascinating Booker-Comstock dynamic, and the fact that it's relegated to an easily missable audio log is criminal. Even without this specific bit of info, though, questions of whiteness are present throughout Infinite, woven into the fabric of Columbia, a city who wears its prejudices on its sleeve for the sake of cementing the dominance of its white denizens. One of the principal faults of whiteness, historically, is how it positions itself above all other perspectives, how it diminishes other voices, treats those who don't fit the hegemonic norm as undeserving of a seat at the table, be it because they are considered inherently inferior, or merely because they are assumed to be not as profitable. Infinite wants to be critical of the ways whiteness has shaped and continues to define American culture, but it commits the cardinal sin of ignoring any perspective outside of whiteness. Daisy Fitzroy is the game's only major non-white character, and you need only look at how that turned out to see that Infinite's writers clearly weren't thinking on this level. I don't think the devs were intentional with this at all. I'd bet that they just didn't think through how this would all come off. But that right there is the exact problem. The need for another perspective wasn't even recognized. The culturally presumed perspective, the white perspective, was the only one given any consideration, which vastly undermines what potential Infinite has towards meaningfully confronting the ugly truths at the core of its story. A lot has been made about how much content Bioshock Infinite left on the cutting room floor, one developer even being quoted claiming that 5 or 6 games worth of content didn't make the final cut. There's also the reality that this is a AAA game, meaning there was likely a lot of publisher influence that changed the specifics of the dev's vision for marketability's sake. Given that Irrational more or less shut down not long after Infinite's release, despite the game being a huge success, hints at the game's development was probably fucked in more ways than the public will ever have a full grasp on. Infinite has problems, that much is clear, but the extent to which those problems, from those I've covered in this video to the many other things I didn't make room to talk about, can be blamed on development trouble as opposed to artistic intention isn't evidently surmisable. It's quite possible all the things I've called flawed about the game are things the devs would agree with, things they would have done differently had circumstances allowed for it. I say all this because, for all the issues I have with the game, I don't want it to come off like I have issues with those who made it. Like I said way back at the beginning of all this, I do still like Infinite a lot, even with all its flaws, and I have a great amount of respect for those whose creativity brought it to life. Infinite takes a lot of big swings, and while some are better considered than others, I can't help but admire its ambitions, its audacity in being about explicitly political concepts in an industry that so often tries to distance itself from being labeled as such. Infinite may not be the most coherent critique of American identity, you may have to squint in order to really take anything concrete away from it, but there's value inherent to making the attempt. Personally speaking, I probably wouldn't be thinking about these things in the way I do today if Infinite hadn't opened the door to it, if it hadn't put under the spotlight so much of what 16-year-old me took for granted about my conception of America, historically and presently, even if the game itself proved unable to reach its full potential. If nothing else, the fact that so much of what this game has to say about the American condition resonates just as well today as it did upon release, more so, even, speaks to the fact that missteps or no, this game was onto something. I remember listening to NPR back in the day and hearing Ken Levine talking about the first Bioshock in the way that creators in other mediums are often invited on to do. I remember thinking, wow, Bioshock really is gaming's foot in the door for actual artistic respect. Looking back, that was certainly overstating it. The discussion around games as art is much older and more complicated than I realized at the time, but the influence of the Bioshock series on the medium's efforts towards artistry really are enormous. Infinite's contribution to that legacy, I think, will ultimately be less about what it did right and more about what it did wrong. A cautionary tale about the perils of narrative maximalism and what happens when the impression of being about big ideas is prioritized over the ideas themselves. Whether you ardently love or vehemently hate Bioshock Infinite, both as far as I'm concerned being completely valid feelings, it is undeniably an important game. A game worth playing, remembering, and critiquing, even all these years later. Hello. If you're hearing this, then that must mean you made it to the end of the video. Congratulations, and allow me to say, sincerely, thank you. It's not just anyone who would watch an entire 40-minute video from someone who's never uploaded anything before. I had a lot of fun making this video. I know I didn't cover everything in the game. It's a pretty dense game. There's a lot going on. I didn't talk about Elizabeth very much at all. I didn't. There's all sorts of stuff I didn't really get to. I didn't talk about Songbird really. I didn't really get into the DLC either. There's a ton of stuff. There's a lot you could say. I didn't talk about gameplay. There's a lot that still be said. If there's anything that you feel is essential to understanding Infinite that I missed, let me know in the comments. And if you just want to read more about Bioshock Infinite, I'm going to link in the description a collection of essays, sort of a compilation of essays that the website Critical Distance put together, which is a big collection of a lot of the work that's been written about Bioshock Infinite since its launch. Obviously, it's not everything, and obviously I haven't read everything in there, but because it's quite a bit. But if you liked this and you're just interested in this kind of writing on games, I think that's something that you'd probably be interested in, and it's not something I knew about until fairly recently. So figured I'd throw that in. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks again for watching. I really mean it. And yeah, see ya.